Welcome, everyone. Glad to see you here today, given the time change. I was hoping everybody would make it. um, Jay tells me that due to Jacob's maybe being out of Wi-Fi range, um, that Marco is going to be teaching in place of Jacob tomorrow, and I'm looking forward to that. Always enjoy Marco. So just expect that. I'm not sure what he's going to teach on, but just use the same URL that you normally use for Jacob. Today we're coming toward the end of the Esther studies, but still got a couple left. And today's study is called Triumph of the Jews. It's Esther 8:9 through 9:17. Now, in our last lesson, we studied the downfall of wicked Haman, who had plotted and planned to have Mordecai hanged on his 75-foot gallows and all the Jews slaughtered in the 12th month. At the dinner she prepared, Esther revealed the fact that she and her people were doomed to death because of Haman. King Ahasuerus had given Haman permission to write that terrible edict that condemned the Jews in the whole Persian Empire. But the king didn't know that his beloved queen was a Jew, or that Mordecai, who had saved his life, was also a Jew. When he realized the treachery of Haman, the king had him hanged on his own gallows. Next, he gave Haman's big estate to Esther, and she put Mordecai in charge of it. Then Esther made one more request, which the king promised to grant. He gave Esther and Mordecai permission to write a new edict on behalf of the Jews. So we saw how God turned the tables on evil and elevated his chosen people. That's what God often does, folks. So let's read Esther 8:9 through 13. So the king's scribes were summoned at that time in the third month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written in accordance with everything that Mordecai commanded the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the officials of the provinces, which extended from India to Cush, 127 provinces, to every province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, as well as to the Jews according to their script and their language. He wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horses, riding on royal relay horses, offspring of racing mares. In the letters, the king granted the Jews who were in each of and every city the right to assemble, to defend their lives, to destroy, kill, and eliminate the entire army of any people or province which was going to attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoils. On one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month Adar. A copy of the edict was to be issued as law in each and every province, was published to all the people, so that the Jews would be ready for this day to avenge themselves on their enemies. Well, after King Ahasuerus had given permission to Esther and Mordecai to write a new edict, Mordecai wasted no time in sending for the royal secretaries. They wrote out the orders to the Jews and the government leaders in all 127 provinces of the great Persian Empire, which stretched from India to Ethiopia. We see that Mordecai was now in a favored role close to the king. He actually replaced Haman, who had been the king's favorite. Once again, the edict was written in the script and language of each people group in the empire, including the language and script of the Jews. Mordecai wrote the dispatches in the name of King Xerxes and sealed them with the king's signet ring, which the king had taken from Haman and given to Mordecai. Then he sent the dispatches by mounted couriers on swift horses, especially bred for the king. It probably took weeks and maybe months in some cases to reach some of the farthest points of the empire. This was very urgent information and it had to go out quickly. So, what was written in the king's edict? The edict sent out by Haman could not be changed according to the laws of the Medes and Persians. So, this new edict didn't cancel out the last one, but superseded it. It granted the Jews the right to assemble and protect themselves. If Haman's edict had been carried out, the Jews would not have had the right to protect themselves and would have been slaughtered like sheep or pigs. Their enemies had been given the king's permission to destroy, kill, and annihilate the Jews, as well as plunder them. Now the Jews were given permission to do the same to any enemies who chose to attack them. They could protect themselves by killing those who attacked them and their families. And they were given the right to plunder the property of their enemies. This was issued as law in every province so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves. The day appointed for this was the 13th day of the 12th month. This was the day that Haman had found by casting lots, the pur. He was looking forward to seeing all of the Jews annihilated on that day. But Haman didn't live to see the tables turn. Let's read on Esther 8:14 through 17. The couriers hurrying and speeded up by the king's command left riding on the royal relay horses, and the decree was issued at the citadel in Susa. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in a royal robe of violet and white, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light, joy, jubilation, and honor. In each and every province and in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was joy and jubilation for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews because the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. The couriers who were spurred on by the king's command raced out to the provinces. Those in Susa, the capital, of course, knew first. Mordecai left the king's presence looking very different than he had before. No more sackcloth. Psalm 112, verse 4 says, "Light shines in the darkness for the upright. He is gracious, compassionate, and righteous." You know, Mordecai didn't have to wear the clothes of mourning now, and the new edict, now that the new edict had been issued. Mordecai was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and purple robe of fine linen. It seems that he'd been promoted to be second to the king. And this will remind us of people like Joseph and Daniel. The Jews in Susa went wild with joy. Psalm 97:10 through 12 says this: "Hate evil, you who love the Lord, who watches over the souls of his godly ones. He saves them from the hand of the wicked. Light is sown like seed for the righteous, and gladness for the upright in heart. Be joyful in the Lord, you righteous ones, and praise the mention of his holy name." So the tide had turned. The victims had the chance to be victors. Besides, everyone who knew that their beloved queen was, now they knew that their beloved queen was a Jewish, and their spokesman Mordecai was now prime minister. What had been a time of mourning and anticipation and dread now had become a time of happiness, joy, gladness, and honor. When the edict reached other cities, the same thing happened there. Sorrow and sadness turned into gladness and joy. There was much feasting and celebrating in sharp contrast to the weeping and grieving that had been done after the first edict. Proverbs 11:10 says, "When things go well for the righteous, the city rejoices, and when the wicked perish, there is joyful shouting." Suddenly the Jews became important and were found to be in the king's favor. So hatred and discrimination turned to admiration. Other nationalities wanted to become Jews so that they could get into this class that was now favored by the king. Fear of and respect for the Jews caused them to want to be Jews. So too the Lord will turn the tables for Messianic Jews and Christians when Christ comes. Those who've been hated and persecuted will be seen to be God's favored people. Let's read on. Esther 9, 1 through 4. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were to be put into effect, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, it turned out to the contrary, so that the Jews themselves gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus to attack those who sought to harm them, and no one could stand against them because the dread of them had fallen on all the peoples. Even all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who were doing the king's business were supporting the Jews because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and the news about him spread throughout the provinces, for the man Mordecai had become greater and greater. The 13th day of the 12th month, on which the Jews were to be destroyed, became their day of victory. This was the day when the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them and annihilate every person of Jewish blood in the entire empire. Since that is where all the Jews were, this might have wiped out the entire Jewish race, much as Hitler tried to do. However, because of God's care for his chosen ones and the faithfulness of his servants, Esther and Mordecai, the tables were turned. The Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities following the king's edict, and they fought their enemies. But there were two added elements. First, the people of the other nationalities were afraid of the Jews, evidently from hearing the amazing story of Haman's fall and the rise of Esther and Mordecai. It was a situation similar to when the Jews first entered Canaan. All the people were afraid because they heard what the God of the Jews had done, how he'd rescued them from Egypt and dried up the Red Sea for them to cross. Their fear made them weak. Psalm 71:24 says, "My tongue also will tell of your righteousness all day long, for they are put to shame, for they are humiliated who seek my harm." Secondly, all the leaders, the nobles, satraps, governors, kings, administrators, helped the Jews out. Why? It was their fear of Mordecai. They could see that Mordecai had come into the second place in the kingdom with a huge amount of power given to him by King Ahasuerus. God had taken this unknown Jew who was destined for the gallows and placed him on the throne next to the king, as he had with Daniel and Joseph. Now Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation had spread throughout the provinces, and he'd become more and more powerful. God had exalted his obedient servant who had been faithful to him in spite of the threats of Haman. So now the once despised Jews, whom the people were hoping to annihilate, had two of the top positions in the empire. Queen Esther and Prime Minister Mordecai had unlimited power over the king through their influence. Suddenly, the Jews had become a respected and honored minority who were feared by their enemies. We'll remember from 2 Samuel 3:1, it says, "Now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David became steadily stronger, while the house of Saul became steadily weaker." None of this powerful influence could have taken place in Persia without the threat of death. God used Haman's wickedness to bring about a crisis that led to the great change in the Persian Empire. In the same way, Joseph would never have been next to the king without having been sold as a slave and later being put in the king's prison unjustly. Daniel would never have influenced four rulers of the Babylonian Empire and the Medo-Persian Empire without being taken captive to a foreign land. So God is at work, though we may not understand his thoughts, messages, methods, and ways. Boy, is that ever true. Salvation could not have come to the lost like you and me without the suffering and death of Jesus, God's Son. Isaiah 55:9 says, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Let's finish out Esther 9:5 through 17. So the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did as they pleased to those who hated them. At the citadel in Susa, the Jews killed and eliminated 500 men, and they killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Arad, Aradatha, Parmashta, Erisai, Eridai, and Vaizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamadatha, the Jews' enemy. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed at the citadel in Susa was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and eliminated 500 men, and the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel in Susa. What have they done? What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what's your request? It shall also be granted you. And what's your father's wish? It shall also be done. Then Esther said, if it pleases the king, let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to do according to the edict of today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the wooden gallows. So the king commanded that it was to be done so, and an edict was issued in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month, Adar, and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Now the rest of the Jews who were in king's provinces assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies, and to kill 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. This was done on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. It seems that there must have been a lot of hard feelings, discrimination, and hatred against the Jews through the Persian Empire. Maybe people had been persecuting them and just waiting for the chance to destroy them. They evidently had many enemies because when the day came for the king's decree to be carried out, they killed 500 men in Susa with the sword. They also killed the 10 sons of Haman. No doubt Haman's poisonous hatred had infected his sons, so they were among the foremost enemies of the Jews in Susa. Besides that, they no doubt carried a grudge because of their father's death was brought about by a Jewish queen. 3 times it says in these verses they did not lay their hands on the plunder. But they'd been given the right by the king to assemble to annihilate any armed force that attacked them and to plunder their enemies. Why didn't they take the plunder? Well, you know what? This was a wise decision. If they took the plunder, it would appear that they were like murderers who killed to get someone's property. People could see that they were only seeking justice, not trying to get rich at their enemy's expense. Lust and greed were not part of the picture. When the king received the report of the deaths in Susa, he went back to Queen Esther. He told her that 500 men had been killed in Susa, plus Haman's sons. Then he asked what else she would request. Maybe it was hard for the king to see his subjects being killed, but Haman's edict had stood and been carried out. Probably multitudes of Jews would have died, including women and children. Evidently, the king was not angry over these deaths, but instead continued to extend his grace to Esther, asking her what more she wanted. Esther asked for 2 things: that the edict be extended 1 more day only in Susa, and that Haman's 10 sons be hanged publicly. The king agreed to this request. Evidently there were a large number of Jews in Susa, so they had not been able to finish the job in one day. The following day, they killed 300 more men. I think the public hanging of Haman's sons was a warning to those who, like Haman, might plot destruction of the Jews. It seems that only the men who were the Jews' enemies were targeted by the Jews. No women or children were harmed. Haman's edict had called for the annihilation of all the Jews, young and old, women and little children. We see that in Esther 3:13. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to annihilate, kill, and destroy all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. He wanted to see everyone with Jewish blood be destroyed, even the innocent. The Jews fought only with their enemies who tried to kill them. And once again, they didn't touch the plunder. This meant that the families of the men who were killed still retained their homes, lands, and possessions. It was a merciful and wise thing to do. Meanwhile, the Jews throughout the provinces assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. 75,000 men were killed. This shows that the number of Jews in the Persian Empire must have been maybe 1 million or more. All this took place in the provinces of the 13th day of the 12th month. On the 14th day, they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. Once again, God had rescued them. And I think it's very important to see below the surface of this killing of many people. King Ahasuerus' decree did not stop the Jews from killing whole families, and it specifically said that they could plunder their victims. But the Jews had a higher standard that God had given them. They were given freedom to harm and take what they wanted, but they refused to use that freedom in the wrong way. So we as Christians have been given freedom in Christ, but we, like them, must be wise and use self-control. 2 Corinthians 3:17 says, "Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." Galatians 5:13 says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but serve one another through love." Galatians 5:22 through 23, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law." And 2 Peter 1:5 through 7, "Now for this very reason also, applying all diligence in your faith, supply moral excellence, and in your moral excellence, knowledge, and in your knowledge, self-control, and in your self-control, perseverance, and in your perseverance, godliness, and in your godliness, brotherly kindness, and in your brotherly kindness, love." Let us not use our God-given freedom in the wrong way. God has called us to a higher standard. We must not act or react like the men of the world do. We carry Christ's name, so let's be sure to bring honor to that glorious name.